Executive Director, Japanese American Citizens League. David, great to see you as well. Well, we had the opportunity there to get out our school colors, and that is important. But more important today is that we talk about the colors of Vincent Chin. And as I sit with all five of you, I cannot help but wanting to download all of your remembrances, all of your emotions, and all the actions and best practices that you brought to the years after the death and murder of Vincent Chin. And I want to remind our panelists, please be as honest, as vulnerable. That means laughing and crying and hooting and hollering. Let's do that, because from death came birth, as all of you know. Helen, what is the moment that you remember that causes you the most emotion?
First, is this on?
It is on.
Richard, you know that Roland, Jim, and I have a lot of memories.
Yes.
So we only have a little time, but the one that I remember most was meeting Vince's mother, Lily Chen, for the very first time. And that was March 20th or 21st, but one of those days. The sentencing was done on March 16, 1983. I remember meeting Kin Yi and Henry Yi, not related, but there was a big Yi family here in Detroit's Chinatown. And I met them on the day that the news came out, and the next thing we talked about was having a meeting at the Golden Star restaurant in Ferndale, where Vincent Chin had worked. Some of you who did the bus tour, we stopped right in front of the Golden Star restaurant, former. And we had a meeting in a small private room. Jim and Roland were both there as well. All of the 10 Asian American attorneys in the entire state of Michigan were there, pretty much. And as we met, Lily Chen was toward the back of the gathering of about 20 to 30 people, and she sobbed in grief the entire time. So it was very painful to be sitting there talking about what we can do. She was racked with grief because the sentencing was as though Vincent had been killed all over again. It was a terrible, terrible moment. And it just underscored the incredible imperative of all of us there to try to, what could we do? She was there to know what could we do. And so that was I think the most heart-rending moment that I had first. I mean, of course, there was the news of Vincent Chin's killing in 1982. Then there was the terrible sentencing, and those were all very shocking moments that I remember vividly. But the most personal, heartbreaking moment was to meet Vince's mother and to feel then the resolve of whatever we can do, we have to do.
What did you tell Vincent's mother each time? And for those of you who have seen her cry, it is not a cry without deep, 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 deep pain. What did you tell her when she was going through those moments? Because you were there throughout. Each time she was wrecked by having to relive this.
You know, I think all of us had a special bond with Lily Chen, with Mrs. Chen. You know, out of respect, actually, we always called her Mrs. Chen. We were the young ones. And sometimes it wasn't words. We would just hold her, hold her hand, reach out around her shoulders and hug her and let her know we were there with her. There would be, and you know, in those moments where she was captured on film many times in her deepest grief and sorrow and pain, you don't really get the picture of the full Lily Chin just as a mother, a human being. She was funny. She told jokes. She tried to match each of us with each other. She was a real matchmaker. And I mean, once I was, as the press secretary, meeting a reporter who I was just meeting for the first time, she grabbed his hand, his left hand, and pointed. It didn't have a ring on it. And she said, "Helen!" And I was standing there, and she grabbed my hand. And it was sort of like, "Okay, Mrs. Chin, thank you." And, so we would have those moments, and she was so generous. And we would have many meetings at her home. She cooked meals for us. She gave us her opinion on many, many things about cooking, about Chinese restaurants, and she read each of the 2 daily newspapers in English every day. She watched the news, of course, in English on TV here. So the idea that she, she was just so full of grief, and that was the main thing about it. She knew everything that was going on. We didn't take a step without consulting with Mrs. Chin first. And she would ask questions, and what would we tell her? We are doing everything we can to take this to every court in the nation if we have to, because what happened to her son was wrong, and we were going to be working for justice. That is what she wanted. That is what we wanted, because we knew that what happened to her son could have been any other son, any other child, any other mother or father who happened to remind people of the hate they had for Japan. And so she was very clear about that. That's why she was doing this, and that's why what we told her everything what we were doing, and she was very much a part of everything we planned.
Roland, for you, take us back. What was that story that you would give comfort? And tell us that story in your remembrances of how Lily may have tried, Mrs. Chin may have tried to hook you up too.
Well, she wouldn't do that because I was engaged already to be married. So that didn't occur. But I just want to talk about the recollections of that time. And really, it was the phone call that Kin Yi, as the head of the Chinese Welfare Council, gave to me as the president of the local chapter of OCA, the Association of Chinese Americans, and that we were together going to be at this meeting to sort of figure out what to do. It was just a painful thought that here are 2 organizations that are not equipped to handle a civil rights case, of which the magnitude, the importance of the case was really not clear to us at the time, but it was something that had to be done. We had to have a meeting. And really it was an opportunity to meet at the Golden Star with a lot of people who we really didn't know very well. And so that was sort of the beginning, in my mind, of the movement for justice for Vincent Chin. And of course, there was a lot of bonding that occurred. Lily Chin was a true champion, but a very gracious person. So I forever remember her knitting a sweater for me. During the time of the case, and I think she knit a sweater for you, Jim. But anyway, and she always cooked up a storm when we had meetings at her house. And so those are just fond memories that I have of Lily in terms of developing a family in the course of that justice movement for Vincent.
What was it like, Roland, when you were there? What was she like throughout the hours or days? How would it go for her? Would she begin without emotion? Would she start with a lot of sorrow? What was the ebb and flow of the day you would spend with her at the house?
I'd say she was grieving, no question about it. I mean, she was of a single mind in terms of finding justice for Vincent Chin, making sure that we were doing things that were fostering, progress in the case. And really, no, it was in the back of her mind, I think, in terms of, remembering Vincent. But she was resolute in terms of, remembering the importance of the case and remembering her son. So,
Yes, absolutely, please.
Mrs. Chin told us that she woke up every day crying and that she went to bed every night crying. But in between, when we were meeting with her, when we would go to her home, she was just so full of life and outward going. And while we were meeting her, she was cooking or telling us stories or knitting. She was always doing something. She was not that image that is in the film Who Killed Vincent Chin. So
She was the CEO of this effort.
she was the moral and spiritual leader of this movement.
Thank you for that. To all of our panelists, as was said, I'm a cable news anchor, so I'm used to folks butting in. Please, absolutely, it's conversational, and let's hang out here. Jim, what's the scene, if you will, that always stands out in your mind from that time that activated you?
I think for me, the case was sort of just right. When the first recordings came out in 1982, I didn't think much of it. It was just, unfortunately, at that time in Detroit, there was about 3 or 4 murders a day, so it gets kind of lost in the news cycle like that. But once the sentence came down, I realized this is an awful result. It really hit me hard because Vincent was only about 1.5 years younger than I am, so I can relate to that at a very visceral level. And I said to myself, that could have been me easily. And I would hope that if I were killed, justice would prevail, and obviously it didn't in this case. So that certainly was a highly motivating factor. And I remember that meeting at Golden Star was pretty morbid, I guess, is probably the best description. Everybody was really upset. And unfortunately, the number of lawyers that you can count on 2 hands and some fingers left over, basically. They were looking for help. I think especially the people in the Leon and the Welfare Council were really, really upset about that. And one thing, just a little background, my family has been involved in the food business for almost 60 years at the time. Business closed, but we sold to every Chinese restaurant. So my family, my father knew Paul Wang. I've known him as long as alive. They were second uncle to me. So it made it a little bit easier as far as trying to, to relate to him from that standpoint. But I would be remiss to say that all of our experiences with Mr. Chen were just sad. I mean, we had some fun times. And one thing I'm very fond of remember is she tried to teach me how to play mahjong. She says, do this. No, no. That kid's okay, sorry. Spent a whole night doing it. I still don't know how to play mahjong.
We've heard about that.
She says, look, you tell by feel. She actually was so good that she actually told the pieces by the marking code before she actually turned them over. So.
How did she describe Vincent to you?
A good, devoted son, very loyal, family first. And I think the person was ready to make that transition from just being a bachelor and kind of fun-loving guy to becoming a responsible married man. And that was really the tragedy. I mean, here is the cusp of a new chapter in his life is just erased without a trace. And I think that's very troubling. I think for any of us who've gone through this life cycle, you hit certain junctions that, hey, this is my next phase.
Right.
You got to enjoy it. In fact, if you were allowed to, you'd probably be a grandfather, and if grandkids, I'm sure Mrs. Childers enjoyed the grandkids at a certain point in time, but that was stolen.
Vincent would be 67 now if he hadn't been killed.
1982. Daphne, what was your remembrance of the killing and murder of Vincent Chin?
Well, I have to say that in '82, I was actually in college in those years, and unfortunately, we didn't have like Asian American Studies at that time. But when I became OCA Executive Director in 1990, I don't think I ever realized how much of my work was spent on working on hate crimes legislation at OCA and JACL. We were the only 2 national Asian American organizations based in DC during that time in the 90s and the 80s. And so actually I spent a lot of time working on hate crimes legislation, but also as a result, actually having to go with the JCL executive directors during those years to sit in and monitor and fight also for other hate crime cases against Asian Americans during those 90s. And I have to tell you, I had never ever been in a courtroom before. I had never seen murder suspects up close and personal. It was an emotionally difficult. The first case I ever sat in on was the Jim Liu case in North Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina in the early 90s. It was a hate crime case that actually was the very first case that got prosecuted for an Asian American victim as a hate crime case. And that was due to the advocacy of organizations like JACL and OCA, that we were able to get enhancements so that crimes committed as hate crimes got enhanced sentences. And it was just really eye-opening to actually sit in, monitor, and to be able to be a representative on behalf of the community, to be able to get the word out using the media as well, to let the whole world know that, unfortunately, as a result of the Vincent Chin case in the earlier years, that these cases continue to happen year after year after year. And as I said yesterday earlier, that unfortunately hate crimes is the one issue that binds the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander community together, because first of all, no one can tell us apart. And so it is the one issue that really binds us together. So I think the work that's been done, and I hope that they will talk about it more, Helen and Roland and Jim, the coalition work, how key and critical it is, not only within the AAPI and HPI community to address these issues, but within the African American, the Hispanic, and the broader community as well, and the Jewish community as well too.
I want to mention that for us in the hinterland, getting to Washington was very important. And so we really should acknowledge Ron Wakabayashi of JCL and Laura Chen of OCA, the national office at the time, getting the attention of William Bradford Reynolds, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights in the Department of Justice, for bringing the attention to them, the importance of this case. And so really, it's that connection to Washington that was so important, developing during the Chin days.
I think as Roland mentions, is the importance, and this, as we talked about, 1990 wasn't that far back, right? But to have two organizations having a national presence, staff on the ground, that can go into meetings with members of Congress or administration or the White House, right, to be able to advocate and be the voice for Asian Americans is so key and critical. And I think that one of the things that's transpired since the 90s has been the growth of the Asian American presence, of the national presence, with staff in Washington, D.C. that can continue to advocate on all these issues.
And I know we've said this many times about that 1983 moment after sentencing and the killing of Vincent Chin in 1982, that was a pivotal moment in Asian American history. But what Daphne just described is the situation for Asian Americans back then. She's describing 1990. In the 1980s and previous to that, we were so invisible and so separate from each other as well. And it really was this case, this moment, this epicenter here in Detroit that really was the turning point, that moment that our communities came together and started to make a visible, loud, outspoken effort to say, we exist. We're here as Americans. We deserve the full rights and fairness and justice that every American is entitled to, but all, as we know, don't get. But this was the moment. And so all of the, coming together, the voices of OCA and JCL, and then the newer organizations that came following that. We look at Washington today and the visibility and presence and activism in DC now, that was, many of them say it was inspired by the Vincent Chin.
Of note, if you think about it, imagine, and for those of you who are involved in AAPI, NGOs, and CBOs, imagine the time we only had one or two. One or two. Now, if you go to DC and try to meet every one of them, that's a whole lifetime. That's in a good way.
That was only 4 people in the 80s and 90s. Literally, there were 4 staffers in DC working on behalf of entire Asian community.
David Inoue, I'll get to you first, David, because on this very idea of remembering institutional memory, civil rights organization for our broad AAPI community, you definitely have a historic institutional perspective. Share with us that, plus your own remembrance, when you first said, Vincent Chin.
Yeah, so Daphne just said she was in college. I was actually in elementary school when Vincent Chin
Thanks a lot, David.
You know that you don't need to do those things.
So actually,
Be nice, David.
so my memories are very different. My personal memories are actually more from a different perspective. First of all, why JACL was important is I got all my news about this through the Pacific Citizen, which is our newspaper, which every JACL member received as a paper copy. And that time it was much more frequently than it is now. Basically every week we would get this. And that was how I read about what was happening and what was going on. For me personally, though, I'm actually of mixed Japanese and Chinese ethnicity. So it was always easier for me to associate with my Japanese ethnicity because the name, I'm a Shin Nisei, so my father actually came from Japan. And people just sort of identify, the way you must be Japanese. But then when I learned about Vincent Chin and the circumstances of how he was killed by being mistaken as Japanese for a child, there was this recognition of, yeah, I am Japanese, I am Chinese, but people don't even see that. They don't care about either one of those. All they see me as a chink, a Jap. And it was just that understanding that dehumanization that was happening to me as a child. And then the other part of where I really became aware of what was going on is because I was growing up in Cincinnati. And the trial was moved to Cincinnati, and my mother actually was part of the court watch that the local chapter was organizing. So she spent, I believe it was a week in that courtroom observing what was happening, and would come home and talk about what she was seeing, some of the frustrations of how she saw the case being presented, laid out, that was Vincent Chin really getting a fair shake by our legal system. So, and that kind of set the stage, I think, for me and where my career is now. Really back then, 40 years ago.
Well, thank you, Mrs. Inoue, for that.
She's in the audience.
Oh, she's right here in the audience.
Thanks, Mom. She's the one waving her hand in case you're curious. David, what is it that you remember her telling you that stuck out in your mind that says, I can't believe this, I got to do something?
Yeah, it was that coming home every day and just the talking about how the lawyers were presenting the case, were they really bringing in the
Paraphrase for me.
the fact that there was racism here.
Yeah, paraphrase it for me. What did she say to you? David, blah, blah, blah.
God, this is 40 years ago.
I won't tell her.
Yeah. No, it was just, I think it was just the anger that she was bringing home with her, and just picking up on that. And as a kid, it was not really so much that she was talking to me directly about what was going on. Right. It was more of the sensing the emotion, and I think the upset that she was feeling. It was just. I hear about. So I don't have a direct connection to the incarceration experience for Japanese Americans, but hearing people talk about when they talk to their parents about that and the emotion that's there about the experiences they felt. It's sort of like that same, the visceralness of it. And I think that's really, particularly as a child, that's what you pick up on. It's not any particular words or anything. It is just more of the anger and the sadness that is felt.
Yeah, I unfortunately, very late in the game, as I was describing earlier, it was 2007. It was when I said, there's a man called Vincent Chin. And then I reached out to Roland, and I reached out to Helen. And Helen, I want to ask you, from all of that great pain and all of the process and all the work you've done since then, to go back, just if you can't describe for all of us, What was that moment of metamorphosis? Because you did not study or think that you would be doing this for the majority of your great work in your life. You were something else. And you decided, I'm picking up, I'm going to Detroit. What was that moment, if you can describe, of metamorphosis?
So, in a journey of life, there are many different metamorphoses and evolutions, but you know, when I was, I had followed that path of just thinking, if I study hard, I can get to college, I can get a scholarship, and then I can go to college. And then what do I do with my life? And in college, I actually wanted to do something larger than myself. I didn't know what that was. And being the child of immigrants who had nothing, you know, and I started working in our little family business in our house when I was 5. And, you know, the options to me were very limited that I knew of. I didn't know there was this thing called investment banking or whatever that the world offered. So doctor was one of the things. And so even though I studied politics, sociology, you know, history, and loved those things, I applied to medical school and I got it. And so I say it like that because the moment I got there, I realized what a terrible mistake I had made. And for those of you who have gone to professional or graduate school, you know, really most of them are geared to making you mold to the culture of it, not necessarily the knowledge in and of itself. And so back then, there were very few women in medicine, very few people of color in medicine, and I just thought, this is not what I want to do. And friends of mine, so I quit medical school, which made my parents incredibly unhappy, you know, as you can imagine. Some friends said, if you really want to know about social change in America, you should go to the heartland of America. And I just thought, what a great idea. And I was idealistic in my 20s, and I just picked up. I didn't actually know anybody in Michigan at that point, but I had friends of friends who back then, you know, there was a huge youth movement going on in the world, and there was here in the United States, but also globally. And I thought, okay, good. I could go to a friend of a friend of a friend and crash with them, sleep on their living room floor until I found a job. And within 2 weeks of arriving in Detroit, which at the time the auto industry was booming, I got a job as a large press operator with Chrysler Corporation in a stamping plant. And just to give some context, back then, as a medical school dropout and a college graduate, I could get $1.50 an hour as minimum wage. When I got to the auto plants, it was almost $10 an hour, and every benefit you can imagine. And so it was just, that was why the auto industry was, people wanted to work there 30, 40 years there, and have their children and grandchildren work there. These were stable jobs. And why the turning point was I got to know people very well because you were working closely with them for 8 hours a day for your shift, your 5-minute break, and your 15-minute lunch. You would sit down right next to your machines and talk with each other, you know, see each other after work. I went to many people's, you know, kids' birthdays, just parties, and got to know them. And when the bottom fell out, you just could see everybody's pain too, and the misery and what they were giving up. They weren't giving up jobs. They were giving up lifetimes. They were giving up their security. They were giving up their family future. And so I saw all that. And so I guess the turning point was when I realized that that myself, as well as they, possibly had no possibility of a job in the future because auto had collapsed. And then I also saw that nobody was really telling their stories. And it was at that point that I said, I could do, well, I'll tell you what I actually said when I saw it on the news. I said, this is shit. I could do better than this shit. And actually with those words, I thought,
got good ratings, by the way.
I could do better than that. And with no writing background or anything like that, I just thought at least I could tell these stories because nobody else is doing that. What I will do is better than nothing. And so that was my shift into writing and becoming a journalist.
So actually, I think one of the messages to people here is the path to doing this work is to drop out of med school. Because I'm actually a med school dropout myself. So.
Wow.
And did you also use the famous quote of Helen Zia as well when you did that?
Since my mother is in the audience, she generally told me, oh yes, my 10-year-old son is also in the audience. Less colorful.
Sorry.
That's all. We'll leave all of it, Helen. It's fine. They didn't hear it past the stage. Since you're talking, David, tell us, what was that aha moment for you? I'm getting into this. I'm going to be part of this AAPI civil rights work.
So actually, I think part of it is dropping out of med school. I mean, that's an incredibly, well, in my case, I might not have been as voluntary as Helen was. I actually failed out of med school, which is an incredibly humbling experience. You think that you are all the Helen's word, and then everything's kind of taken away from you, and you're sort of left with this, what do I do now? So I actually worked at a Japanese restaurant for a year, and actually growing up, I worked in a department store. So those types of experiences sort of made me realize that, yeah, not everybody goes to college. Not everybody has everything kind of laid out for them like some of us do. And my parents gave me the opportunity to go to college, go to a very good college. But not everybody has those opportunities. And what can we do to ensure that people who are in situations like I was, where I thought I hit rock bottom, dropping out of med school, that there is a hope and that there is opportunity for people in this country. And right now, I feel like we're even further away from that than we were 20, 30 years ago. That we are in such a stratified society now that we don't have those opportunities. And how do we find that for people?
Thank you. Roland, share with us, and the reason why I'm going down this road before we hit the last wave, and then we're going to have some questions and answers. I think there's 2 microphones. And ready your questions, please, and comments. Keep them as brief as you can when you do them. Roland, the reason why I ask this is because, you know, we all have that moment where we say, I need to do this stuff. And for you, Vincent Chin was a big reason why you said, I want to do this stuff. I'm trying to pull out what that was like, so as all of us reconsider on this day how we will be rededicated and be reborn in that idea, to pull the lessons from what all of you have seen in your journey with Vincent Chin. Share with us what that was like. Should I do this? I'm a lawyer right now.
Well, the story is, I always wanted to please my father, and my father said, well, he was a Ford engineer, so I had the aspiration of just being a Ford engineer, and I was a Ford engineer, but I wasn't satisfied with that, and I wanted to go to law school, so I went to law school, and then went to Ford as a lawyer. But the Vincent Chin case caused a redirection. Now, I continue to be a lawyer at Ford, but the after-hours work with American Citizens for Justice and all of the tentacles that follow that. It's because of the Vincent Chin case that I was invited to talk to the Association of Asian American Studies. And after that, I was invited to teach about Asian Americans in civil rights, and have been doing that for 27 years. And the Vincent Chin case was the reason why Jim and I were appointed hearing referees for civil rights. And so this is a story of redirection in terms of, I thought I was just going to be a corporate lawyer, but no, there's a lot more to that.
I kind of asked that question, Roland, because when I sat with you and your family and your kids 5 years ago, his children also are now that second generation of eyes open when it comes to what Vincent Chin meant for our country and for this idea of AAPI civil rights. I thank you for sharing that. How about you, Jim? What was that metamorphosis point related to the Vincent Chin case?
For the case, one thing about being a lawyer, you do routine work, and you bill hours, and you represent insurance companies like I did for a long time. And even though that's intellectually challenging, there's nothing satisfying about it. You're just basically moving money around, and people yelling at each other according to the depositions and the like. So for me, the opportunity to really do something meaningful, like Helen said, there's more to life than just simply a job and making money. There has to be some purpose behind it. You have to feel like you're actually making a difference, and that was a big part of it. I think we had this sort of cathartic moments that, you know what, this is bigger than me. I want to be part of it. I want to be able to make a difference, make a contribution. I know for the three of us especially, spent many years with Mrs. Chen, and to a person who says, listen, to our dying breath, we'll do what we have to do to try to put this guy where he belongs, somewhere else. And even now we're still chasing. He has dealt with what, 8 million? 10 with compounded interest and all that. Hesitated dying. And we are constantly trying to reap the money and figure some way how to get some of the restitution Mrs. Chin's owed. But for all this, like I said before, it's something that it's changed my life. I mean, at the time when the case started, I was 29. I'm turning 69 this year. Of course, always be young. but for me, it's really shaped and been part of my adult life. And certainly it's covered probably like 95% of my career as a lawyer in the background. So no matter what I do, where I go, it's always there. It's part of what defines me. It's given me opportunities to meet all kinds of people. It's caused me to have friendships that are lasting and enduring. And I'll be forever grateful for that reason.
It sounds like so far there's at least one theme. Your side gig became your main gig. Your side gig became exactly your reason for being throughout the time that you were involved in our community work. Daphne, how about for you? What is that moment for you related to the Vincent Chin case where I'm going to stand up a little bit taller?
Well, I think for me, it's always been that being one of really 2 national staff to represent the entire community in DC. It's like you're put into a position where you have to use your voice. And for those that may know me, and as a young child, I was actually very, very shy, and I did not speak, really. And so for me to really be given the opportunity to really speak out on behalf of the Asian American community, I realized that if it wasn't myself or the JACL DC rep that I worked with over those years, if none of us were speaking up at the table, and we all talk about being at the table, then our community would not be represented at all. And so it's sort of being thrust into those positions, those platforms that you're given, and really seizing the moment, seizing those opportunities, and not letting it go by, because if we didn't speak up, then nobody would. And so I think that goes back to the importance of having that Washington, D.C. representative really being advocates, really using our voices to speak up. And I think now more than ever, right, we really as AA and HPIs have got to speak up so that we are not left behind on these issues. But the Vincent Chin, absolutely, as Helen said, right, is a fundamental seed. And thank goodness, due to all the education over all these 40 years and really being able to bring the limelight to this case and what it means, really is at least one fundamental bedrock that we as a community can really continue to work off of.
Yeah, I think that one of the big changes, obviously, since Vincent Chin is back when it was OCA and JACL. But just a couple days ago, there was a signing of the museum bill, and that room was filled with the leaders from the many different Asian Pacific American organizations that exist now. And there's NCABR, which has over 40 members, which when it was founded, it was largely JACL and OCA that were sort of leading the formation of that. But now you see every community in our APA community is represented in Washington, D.C.
Let's take ourselves to June 19th, 2022, and we have to look back to look forward, and we have to learn from all of your journeys and what you went through, because it inspires all of us in everything that you've done. And you brought up one thing that's happened in this great year, and that is a recognition that this community of other now needs to be solidified as, yes, part of this great country. And a museum, a Smithsonian for Asian American Pacific Islanders is certainly one part of that, right? It is like in New York City, for the first time, we now have a historical landmark that is an AAPI in 2021 and 2022. First time in a city that has been warm to so many other waves of immigration. We will also next week will have the first Unity March, a gathering of all groups led by the AAPI community. But this all happened because of what you 5 have just shared with us, what you've built over the years through your institutions and through your efforts after that horrific first moment of AAPI civil rights, Vincent Chin. If we did not have the foundation that you invested in, we would not be able to react as we have had to in March 16th, 2021. It's been a tough couple of years, certainly. Another spike that I know none of you wanted to see. What are some of the best practices, if you will, to think about what you've been working on since your Vincent Chin moment to today that you think has worked out well? And then tell us, what do we need to do going forward for the next, and I won't say 40 years, but I'll say for the next 5 years, based on what you've learned in the past. And I'll start with you, Helen.
Wow, best practices, okay. I want to say, without having to read it all, this legacy guide, the Vincent Chin Legacy Guide, we actually have on the back of the cover. Every one of you got this in your gift bags, swag bags. And so number one best practice is to be informed, to know what's going on. In 2020, it was heartbreaking to see how many Asian Americans recorded something on their cell phones to say, somebody just spit on my baby as we were going for a walk, and yelled whatever slurs they had to say, go back where you came from, or worse, right? Not just breathing or spitting or threatening them, but we know it got a lot worse than that. And actually in 2020, even before the garbage that came out of the White House, accusing China and blaming and all of the new slurs that came out of there, those of us who knew the lessons of the Vincent Chin time and the anti-Asian hate back then, I posted on my Facebook page, a train wreck is coming, a train wreck, and I got one of those GIFs that showed a train wreck coming. We saw this, we even talked about the possibility of a mass killing, and all the things we talked about actually have come to pass. And so it was heartbreaking to see people say, wow, I didn't know this could ever happen to Asian Americans, that those were coming from Asian Americans, let alone the larger society, which we understand even today, 40 years after we started trying to do this education and break through this invisibility and ignorance, that other people were saying, does this happen to Asian Americans? The racism? And so number one, I would just say, please look at this because it has recommendations, things that, the Unity March by New Jersey, Illinois, California have mandated in their legislatures teaching some things, K through 12. And actually, if I may,
Yes.
the Smithsonian Institution, and there are some representatives from the Smithsonian who are part of this. This is going into, our plan is every middle school and high school with questions that were developed by the Smithsonian and, to go along with the museum. There is going to be some preparation for that education. So number one, education. And the other is speak up. Those lessons that our ancestors or even our immigrant and refugee parents tell us, like stay under the radar, don't make waves, don't be the nail that gets hammered down. And what we said in the early days of organizing here in Detroit, when people said, if we speak up, will we just draw more of these hate incidents toward us? What we said to them was, if we don't speak up, this will continue. And that's why we must speak up. And today, we must speak up. We've made observations that actually the 1980s were a decade of hate and killing. And actually in here we've documented some of those too. So Vincent Chin was the first one whose name we recognize, but there were so many others. And we've observed that actually this time feels even worse. So we must speak up. All of you are here because you do that, but we really need to reach out more deeply into all of our communities. And we have to come together and organize. And so I just want to take a moment, because we haven't done this, to recognize and thank all of the people who were part of making these days possible. And I'd like to start, I don't know if they're here, but Rebecca Islam, her crew from AAPI and Alex and so many other people, and Deborah Nakatomi and Amy Watanabe, who were part of the Rita Benavidez, Sarah Ying Roudzaville, and also Larry Baranski, who is somewhere all around here.
He's everywhere.
He is everywhere, but he made these venues possible and all of this. So I just that is one of the best practices too. You organize, you come together, you speak out, the ones who don't mind being upfront, even if they were shy when they were little kids, and speaking up, to be there and support each other and to take care of each other and show gratitude to each other. So we are so grateful to all of you and the people who came to make this happen. But those are among the best practices. And don't be the nail that sticks out, be the nail that jacks people and say, hey, pay attention.
Daphne, you brought up the idea of coalitions.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that, and going back to your best practices, that I think we need more of, a lot more of us. When I was OCA Executive Director, we had an internship program, but I placed interns at the NAACP Washington, D.C. office. And you'll talk about lobbying and civil rights. I mean, it was one major powerhouse office to be in. So for those interns that had that opportunity to learn from our African-American colleagues, those are the best experiences, and we need a lot more of that. We need to really be able to be members of, attend the conventions, be interns, become staff of those other organizations, and I think that's how we really continue to build that coalition work. And as Paula Madison said, right, especially for now, so many of our multiracial members of our community, right, they are a tremendous bridge, especially into that coalition work that needs to be done.
And with respect to other communities, this is something I've learned in the news space and trying to pitch out the story of Vincent Chin throughout the years, is find the context and the similarity to perhaps another intersectional moment so that it can be expressed to those who may not understand that there is this idea that Asian American Pacific Islanders are not your model minority and that they have gone through, unfortunately, the same pain points. So find that elevator speech parallel or similarity, the way you might describe what happened, for instance, on March 16th, 2021. How would you describe it to somebody else? How big of a deal was that? What does Vincent Chin mean to this community based on another community? Think of those similarities. Those are ways to communicate that we have some difficulty sometimes.
Just throw out
Yes.
one more example of, I think, and we talked about this yesterday, right now, Juneteenth, Vincent Chin, is June 19th, but then also back in January, February, right, it's Black History Month as well as Lunar New Year. So one of the things that we did at AARP is start to combine these and start to do activities, especially around that February time, Black History Month and Lunar New Year. And we actually brought Paula Madison a few years ago when we were in person to come and speak at that. And we need to find more of those intersectional opportunities among the communities to be able to do this program.
And actually, APA Heritage Month also coincides with Jewish Heritage Month. So we actually did some programming with ADL about shared Japanese Jewish identities. But you're just mentioning what thread ties us all together. I think we can't leave the stage without talking about white supremacist ideology and how that really does underpin all of this. It's why anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, it is all rooted in that. And I don't want to say white supremacists, I'm just talking about the ideology here. And this is where the education is so important to counter that, to instruct people about how does that permeate so much of our society, the structural racism, the systemic racism, that's what we really need to be attacking.
It would be remiss not to mention the fact that what we did back in the 80s as application now, we spent an extraordinary amount of time doing outreach, talking to other groups, NAACP, Detroit Association of Black Organizations, ADL. And when you find talking to other folks in the same space as sort of civil rights is served, our issues aren't all that different. Racism, drives everything. People are facing huge barriers. And I think the sad part is that we had this hope that, my God, we did something back in the 80s, things will be different 40 years ago. Unfortunately, it's gotten worse, quite frankly, with the alt-right and Proud Boys and all these different extremist groups out there. the conditions now are probably much worse. And if you look at the papers and reporting, just attack almost every 5 minutes seems like around the country. It's very sad commentary. I'm telling people, maybe we could be doing this 40 years later, talking about the same topics, but more than the topic itself, it's gotten intense, much worse. You have validation by people in the White House, and the task ahead is just so formidable. And I've been saying to folks, it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. I still have hope. I still believe in the human spirit, but it's going to take a concerted effort by all people, goodwill, positivity, and believe in civil rights and justice to unite and fight back. It's not just with the Asian community. We have to outreach throughout all communities of color, ethnicity, religious groups that have the same obstacles, the same challenges. And this is a thing I ask all you today. It's important we get organized, but get involved with other groups that maybe in the local community. We're in the same boat. Would you realize you talk to them? We're in the same situation. It's important that we kind of validate that and also get engaged, because United we're stronger than any one force or any one race that's out there. We have to fight back.
Roland. I just have 3 thoughts, and that is coalition building. It's something that occurred during the Vincent Chin case. We didn't have the power then to really affect change without a lot of input from a lot of other organizations, civil rights organizations. And that continues. That needs to be tended to today. And moving forward to today, we have that activism. Just drawing attention to the rallies that occurred in 1983, certainly San Francisco, Pittsburgh, New York, Detroit, that happened. March 2021, 60 rallies across the country as a result of the Atlanta killings. And so people are able to be mobilized much quicker now. Yeah. So I'm hopeful. So that's my last watchword. I think we're hopeful in terms of the skill that we have as a community to really draw attention to ourselves, our plight, and but there's still a lot of work to be done.
Fantastic, fantastic. Any questions or comments to the microphones? Come on up really quickly. We want to make sure that you have your voice too. Go for it. Your name, where you're from, and your comment or question.
My name is Alicia Morris. I live here, but I'm a Texan. We spoke of coalitions and something to similarities. I saw on social media somebody speaking of this as the Trayvon Martin, trying to compare it. But Sabrina, Trayvon's mother, started a movement, and there was a book, Mothers of the Movement, but of the Black Lives Matter.
Right.
When I look at this, even though I wasn't born up, more of that Emmett Till, comparison, where people were like, the mother, Miss Chen, Lily, you saw all that pain and sorrow. If you look at old Jet magazines and Ebony magazines, because of course they weren't interviewing her that much, but you could see the pain and, Sabrina was angry and she started something out of it, but Mamie Till, she was, she had all that pain. And then she wanted an open casket to say, see what they did. Mm. And then another similarity is that neither one of them got justice. The people got away with it, and it was obvious who did it. And the killer, the cause of Emmett Till being, murdered, she's still alive,
That is a great comment. Thank you so much. That's super helpful. Please come on up.
And we do make a comparison where we do believe that Lily Chin is like the Mamie Till of our movement. So thank you very, very much to that. And the injustice that happened to Trayvon Martin with his killer getting no punishment, same with Emmett Till's killers, the parallels are very similar to what happened to Vincent Chin.
Hi, I'm Reverend Norman Fong, a fan of Helen, but also I became a minister in the Presbyterian Church in Chinatown in 1981. And then 82, it all happens, and I got to witness, like never before, grassroots Chinatown leadership identifying with women. My call and hope is that we would do more on a grassroots level, every day in all our communities across the country, down to but here's why I'm so happy. I'm listening to all this, and Daphne, I was in DC, 80s for immigration rights. They tried to take away our rights. But collectively, I guess one of the best things that happened with Vincent Chin case is also we, on a community level, started organizing with each other. So we have 45 API community groups meeting one time. But what I love, and I want everyone out there to do, is I started in 1990, a monthly meeting, a Chinatown town hall and it's all in Chinese. And those newer immigrants as well are loudmouth protesters all the time. So let's work on the grassroots movements and building up our communities.
Be a loudmouth. Be a loudmouth is what he said.
Reverend Hwang is going to be speaking at the cemetery later on, so thank you, Norman.
And just a quick reflection, and then for your comment, please, and quickly, I've got the wrap sign that we're going to finish up now. But just reflecting quickly on our last two commenters, and thank you for that, is putting this all together, being intersectional, and the language that we use from a journalist perspective. I share this. Let's lean in on how other communities talk about this concept of, unfortunately, racism. That you pull in the vernaculars of what is the Native American community going through, what is the Black American community going through, what is the Latino American community going through, what is the LGBTQ plus community going through. Those different vernaculars will help us to communicate better that intersectional, that coalition idea when we just think about language. And that's what the idea of Mamie Till and Emmett Till really brings it together, as well as being a loudmouth, if I can, if you will, use those words. Quickly, my friend.
Hi, my name's Michael Shane. I joined with the coalition initially. I was with a community group back in 82, 83 called the All People's Congress. I want to put this into a different context than just the crisis in Ohio. We have to remember there was a rise in the movements of the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis with the election of Ronald Reagan. In fact, in 1981, they held a march in Washington, D.C. The Ku Klux Klan in their hoods. So I call this a lynching of Vincent Chin. That's the context. It's the white supremacy, like you had mentioned. And we pulled back. We offered our initial support, but I want to recount something that happened. When I went to Solidarity House to hand out leaflets for the demonstration at Kennedy Square, I couldn't get in there because they had a sign. I had a Mazda. They said, if you have a Japanese car, go park it in Tokyo. That was really disgusting. Yesterday, I was at a labor conference in Chicago. I went to the Apollo workshop, a beautiful site. You all should see this. Probably about 80 Asian American API activists, labor activists, all over the place now. It is beautiful. It wouldn't have happened in the 1980s, but now we've got labor activists coast to coast fighting for justice for all workers. And I think that I agree with you, we got to build a broad movement of black, brown, red, yellow, and white. Because when we come together as one fist, we're going to win. We're going to beat back these white supremacists. And I appreciate all the work that's been done on commemoration of Vincent Chin. And let's go forward and win. Thank you.
You have a quick comment? Go ahead.
Hello.
Yep, quickly.
You here?
Yeah, we got you.
Oh, great. My name is Karen Shell, and I'm here. I'm here because I know that the lead photojournalist Corky Lee
Yes.
would have been here too. He was present with Jim and many others documenting the Vincent Chin case. He knew that it was a pivotal watershed moment for AAPIs. I had to accept a speech, award, last year on his behalf, posthumously, and the theme that I wanted to talk about is how he had used his camera to fight discrimination, injustice, and stereotypes. And one of the cases that I talked about was Vincent Chin. And in that room, the other honoree was Sean Bell's parents, who had lost their son to violence and police brutality. And I felt that it was important to try to bring us together, the whole coalition building. Because towards the end of my speech, I had an opportunity to talk with Sean Bell's parents, and we embraced, and we understood what that loss is. Most of the cases that we're hearing today, the outcomes for communities of color have not often been good, and particularly for Vincent Chin. And Corky always felt that justice was not served. And he went to Henderson, Nevada, to the house of where Ronald Eben was, because he really wanted to bring to light the fact that he never paid, and he never paid a dime. And the tragedy of Lily Chen having to leave this country to go to China because she saw that there was no justice, and for her to have passed away and not see a dime.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he picked the wrong day because it was a heat wave, and his camera did freeze up, probably heat up, and he said that you need a critical mass.
Mm-hmm.
You need people to show up, and that's how media will cover it. So we have to create this momentum going, especially in light of anti-Asian hate, to continue to put a spotlight on these issues that are very important, and not to forget our history.
Thank you so much. And as we close, that is a great way to finish, because as you know, Corky Lee and T.Hua Chang and Helen Zia, they were the recorders of Vincent Chin 40 years ago. They put it in the history books. It would not be a moment if they weren't there to put it in the media history books, what happened on that day. And there were about 50 Asian American Pacific Islander journalists across the country at that time. Today we have about 2,000. And if there's one way of seeing this as being positive, is that March 16th, 2021 is when we had more than 50 or 5 that happened to be journalists that became civil rights journalists, like Corky Lee did, who was the mentor of many of us, including myself when I first became a journalist. But now we have 2,000 AAPI civil rights reporters to record what happens. And so to all of you, please also keep that story being told. Just as Corky started 40 years ago, he started to take pictures of everything. He wanted to make sure we had the proof. And so now that's what we all can do in terms of this idea of rededication. We're going to finish now. I'd like one sentence from each of you about what makes you feel hopeful about the future. One sentence, that's it. David?
So I've already mentioned my 10-year-old son is here. And for me, it's going to be a little more. And this is why I do it for my 10-year-old son.
We all need to work together and really use our voice and our power.
Don't lose sleep, keep up the fight.
I was going to say the same thing, keep up the fight.
I'll try to make this one sentence, but first I want to take care of each other. And sitting there halfway back there is Mabel Lim, who is 102 years old. Mabel was one of our organizers, and when she was a teenager in Detroit, she was a rabble-rouser too. She and her husband Ray hand-delivered our press releases because there were no fax machines or anything like that back then. And what gives me hope is Joyce Shee, who is our official photographer right here. Joyce, stand up. When we talk about Corky Lee, Corky was one of the mentors of Joyce, and Joyce left the idea of having a career in chemistry and is now a social justice warrior herself, documenting our work. And so all of the best practices that were said, connect the dots, organize, coalition building, speak up, that gives me hope. And we are in the majority. If we come together, we can turn this ship around. So let's do it.
David, thank you so much.
whenever you have a chance, use the facilities or grab a drink of water if you need to. We'll get started in a couple minutes. All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started with the second panel. If you wouldn't mind taking a seat. We want to try to keep to the schedule so that you all can get to the interfaith ceremony around a little after 1:30. Welcome to the second community dialogue on rededication. My name is Ian Shin, and I have the honor and the privilege of moderating this panel this afternoon. I want to start by recognizing that it is Juneteenth. We've already talked a little bit in the first community dialogue about its meaning. Juneteenth, of course, commemorates the announcement and the affirmation of the end of slavery in the United States, specifically in Texas, but it's become a national holiday. It's a day of rest and a day of celebration, but it's also a day to rededicate ourselves to the struggle for civil rights, because we know that emancipation did not automatically lead to equity. And so much like many of the events throughout this weekend, Juneteenth reminds us that the best way to be American is to hold ourselves and each other accountable to the nation's founding ideals, not to bury our heads in the sand about the issues of racism and xenophobia that still plague this country today. So that's what we're here to do on this panel. We are very lucky today to have assembled a group of civil rights leaders and activists and organizers here in Michigan and to learn what their organizations are doing to continue some of the conversation that the first panel talked about in terms of coalition building, and to exchange strategies, ideas about the struggle ahead for liberation and justice. So let me first introduce very quickly each of them, and then I'll tell you a little bit about how we'll continue with this dialogue. So immediately to my left is Sina Vang. Sina Vang is the co-founder of Whenever We're Needed, which supports Asian American, Black, and other marginalized communities. Welcome, Sina. To Sina's left is Celeste Godert, who is an organizer with Rising Voices of Asian American Families. She is also a co-curator of the Japanese American Citizens League's Community History Project, Exile to Motown. Welcome, Celeste. You've got some fans in the audience, Celeste. To Celeste's left is Rima Meruwe, who is the director of the National Network for Arab American Communities, which is based just down the road in Dearborn, Michigan. Welcome, Rima. And last but not least, we have the Reverend Horace Sheffield III, who is pastor of New Destiny Christian Fellowship in Detroit, and also Executive Director of the Detroit Association of Black Organizations, or DABO. And I just want to note that Horace's father got a shout out yesterday in the national conversations from Helen, who mentioned that Horace's father was one of the leaders in the area who helped the Asian American community in the aftermath of the Vincent Chin case. Thank you for being with us today. I should just also mention quickly, my name is Vincent Chin. I am an assistant professor of U.S. History and Asian American Studies at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And I also have the pleasure of serving as Vice President of the Association of Chinese Americans, which is the Detroit chapter of OCA-Asian Pacific American Advocates. So again, thank you so much for joining us today. Let's get started first by learning a little bit about these various organizations that we have represented. I've asked each of the panelists to share just a couple minutes of their organization's work. Sina, can we start with you? Tell us a little bit about Whenever When You're Needed.
Hi everyone, how's it going? Happy Juneteenth. So as Ian said, my name is Sina Vang, co-founder of WWN, Whenever We're Needed. We formed last year after the Atlanta spa shooting. So not only do we fight for Asian representation, but also we fight for the Black community here in Detroit, as well as LGBTQ rights and also the abortion rights. Our movement is quite radical. Thank you.
Celeste, will you tell us a little bit about Rising Voices?
Sure, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. Hi everybody, I'm Celeste Shimoura Geddert. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm a community organizer and soon-to-be campaign coordinator with Rising Voices. Also want to say I wanted to just appreciate sitting in the same chair as my uncle who was on the panel before, and I feel really just grateful to be in the same space with you all. So Rising Voices is actually a C3 and C4 facing nonprofit Asian American women-led organization here in Michigan. And we work to build power and organize with Asian American women, queer people, and families in Michigan. And being the first and currently the only C4 Asian American nonprofit in the state, we feel a certain responsibility to do the partisan work and to be able to endorse candidates who we really believe are going to be able to be held accountable to the issues facing the Asian American community. And I would just quickly add that we really think about building multiple pathways to power at Rising Voices. So while we have this really robust civic engagement work, we also believe in centering healing justice, and then also we have a section we call Rising Voices Amplified, where we really highlight the work of amazing Asian American artists and creators here in Michigan, which there are actually very many, and I'm glad we got to see a few last night. And I would just add that our theory of change also really centers Asian American women and queer people, because in reflecting, a lot of movements end up being about personality or celebrity. Sometimes we get co-opted that way, but at Rising Voices, we really recognize that Asian American women and queer people have been on the front lines, and so that's why our theory of change is really rooted in those identities.
Thank you, Celeste. Rima, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Rima. I am the director for the National Network for Arab American Communities, which is one of Access's national institution. You all may be more familiar with Access being a local organization that provides services for the Arab American community. Some of the work that we do through the network is each of the members are either arts, service-based, or advocacy organizations, and we want to ensure that organizations are. We recognize that people's lives are impacted by multiple areas, and so the intersectionality of all of this comes together through the work that we do to meet the needs of communities, to ensure representation of MENA communities that are not counted on the census and have really been marginalized. And so our work is really to be able to recognize these communities. And I want to say, especially relevant to today, one of the goals and things that we continuously struggle to, but will continue to do, is to work in coalition with communities, because we cannot do this on our own, just like many communities cannot do the work, the civil rights work on their own. And so we continue to hope that we can bring communities together to do this work together.
Horace, please.
First of all, thanks for having me on Father's Day, giving me another opportunity to do what I do every day, which is honor my dad. Part of his life and legacy from the 30s when he was organizing factory workers at Ford was inclusion. He generally believed in the good of all people. and felt he had a responsibility not just to improve the lives of African Americans, but also rallying with others who, like us, sometimes are threatened. We have a really expansive amount of work we're doing at DABLE. We have our own clinic now. We've been funded by HRSA and Town Freedom. We're doing stuff which I think is important because 50% of African Americans in Detroit have hypertension. 62% is not treated. So we can fight for rights, but if you're not here because you're not healthy, it doesn't matter. We still do some about coalition building. It's important for us to have an infrastructure. NAACP, Urban Leagues, all those organizations all under one umbrella. We can coalesce when we need to.
Thank you so much. Let's get into this conversation about coalition building. We heard a little bit in the first panel about the importance of it. And we have with all of us together here today a group of organizations taking different approaches to that kind of coalition building work. Give us some examples of how your organization really does that. How do you reach across different kinds of boundaries, whether it's generational boundaries, racial boundaries? How do you work with other communities? And I want to start maybe with Sina because WWN has kind of a self-consciously multiracial ethos, and then maybe we can move to some of the other organizations that have maybe a primary focus on a certain community, but have also seen that work reach outside that. Sina, can you get us started on coalition building?
Sure. So WWN is not very large. It's a small group of 10 or less people of multiple races. And by building coalition, I mean, the work that we do is a lot of groundwork. Our activism takes place in the streets. So we are out in the streets, we are protesting, we are networking, we are meeting people. And in order to strengthen, our numbers, it's by accepting those invitations from other organizations and being able to have these conversations and just understanding, the common denominator and the values that we may share, even if the mission is different. So that is how our organization builds coalition.
Thank you. Celeste, do you want to add in terms of Rising Voices, how you all look at coalition building?
Sure, thank you. So I think something that we're highly aware of with Rising Voices is the fact that we wouldn't exist at all if it weren't from the help of Detroit Action, which is a low-income Black and brown-led organization here in Detroit. And they really helped give birth to us. So we actually were born in coalition. And so as much as we talk about the focus on Asian American women, queer people, and families, we know just from the jump that our faiths are extremely interwoven. And so I think we hold that in the work that we do. And then, continuing on a high level of coalition on an organizational level, we also, at a national level, have recently joined the Asian American Power Network, which is a national coalition of C4 organizations, so organizations that can do partisan political work. So we make sure that we're having a seat at the table on a national level, but then also in the state of Michigan, we build coalition with other organizations, kind of like Sina was mentioning. So we work with We the People Michigan, we work with Michigan Education Justice Coalition, to name a few, and then we kind of think of this as constant vigilant networking. We want to know what JACL is up to, we want to know what ACA is up to, SAMOSA. And then even, not on a name level, I think coalition is about relationships. Like we keep saying, community and organizing a coalition, but this is really about it's about you and me, it's about your neighbors, the people you're making friends with and meeting who you see in your local community. So I think we also just want to bring it to a more intimate level. We can think of coalition as the people who are around you, and that's really community as well.
I think one of the interpersonal relationships are really important, but when I think of coalition, also there's there are some conversations we have to have internally, and being a part of coalitions is not just about meeting our needs. And so often we come together in coalition for things that impact all of us collectively. But then we also think of coalition, and we do work in coalition for issues that may not necessarily be impacting, for example, the Arab-American community for access. And I think that that's extremely important. That's something that we have to step beyond to say, we are going to be a part of coalition to ensure that each of our communities that has been harmed, we're meeting the needs of his community. And at the same time, we are also working to improve the lives of Arab Americans. But I think that's one of the most important things with coalition is to not think of it as just having impact on the community that we serve, but really thinking about every community that's been marginalized.
I guess I'm next right now. So the very essence of our organization is a coalition. We're a federation of over 130 Black organizations, civic, fraternal, etc. My dad's mantra, I used to ask it in the form of a question, was what's the difference between the pile of bricks and a cathedral? And the word is organization. So we try to be the entity that organizes the bricks. And toward that end, we have a variety of coalitions we created. But let's go back for a moment, because out of the Vincent Chin situation, my dad pulled together the Detroit Inter-Ethnic Coalition that was a federation of various ethnic organizations, ethnic individuals, to address what he thought was a common plight, that it was not just rooted in his lives, but could potentially affect all of our lives. And there are others we've done, but we've really focused on community development lately. So we have a tremendous community coalition of about 40 organizations. We've purchased properties, renovated buildings. We've done stuff in areas of crime. But what's important though, when we talk about coalitions, is none of us on our own are able to accomplish what we are trying to achieve. And it requires working with folks. I always tell people, because I work with folks sometimes that don't agree with me. It's what's more important is the what, not to who. And we like the what to be held hostage by the who. But when you're working to get things done, there is no wrong who.
Thank you so much for that. And I want to just kind of put a point on showing up, right? The building relationships, showing up for each other. And so, we also want to thank folks for showing up today, and also for folks who are watching on the live stream. Thank you for spending your Sunday with us. On that point of what brings us together, right? I think one of the things that we all recognize is that there are a lot of folks trying to divide these communities, right? We're talking about the importance of coalition building, but political commentators, the press, even some members of our own community sort of say, we're not in this together. We want to sort of look after just our own community, right? So tell us a little bit about how you see what is at stake in forming these coalitions, especially multiracial coalitions. Why is it important for us to help people see these bridges? And how do we do that, right? How do we overcome these kind of misleading, disingenuous divisions? Forrest, can we start with you?
Well, I'm probably the oldest one on the panel, so I was sharing with my son yesterday that during the Vietnam War, I had a draft card. Every Sunday morning, you had to look in the paper to see if your number was there. And I remember distinctly, some of those coalitions that included African Americans who opposed to the war. Dr. King took a big hit on that. But the point I want to make is I don't think people understand how dangerous these times are in which we live. The very democracy that we relied upon to make changes in the civil rights movement, to be able to agitate and change the culture. A lot of that's being changed, and it's targeted against all of us who are non-white men. I mean, let's be honest. I call it, white male anxiety. I mean, they're concerned about being displaced. I go to some circles and will say quite honestly, and I'll say it here, is they're afraid of losing something that was never theirs in the first place. And we'll go to any lengths to make that happen. And the real tragedy is, why we need each other is, in spite of everything we've seen happen, January 6th, I don't care what it is, all the norms being changed, that we still have people in our communities who don't feel as if it's a crisis or voting makes a difference. The only thing I think we really have left is our power of voting. And if our communities can come together, and people with goodwill and good conscience can come together, it's more of us than there are of them.
Rima, how do you see having these conversations over and across different boundaries? How do we have these conversations effectively?
I think one of the things that I always think of is, if we continue to work in silos, then we're maintaining the status quo. We're not changing anything. We're not improving anything in any of our communities. And so, in order to, I have to say, I've worked in several coalitions. We don't have time to get into this today, but coalitions tend to be very performative. And I think we need to find true ways of, this is why I was talking about before, of supporting communities through their work, even if it doesn't impact the community we're serving directly. And I think that is the way that we move beyond the performative. And so I think it's important to remind people, in terms of working in coalitions, that if we want the status quo to maintain, then we continue to work in silos. But if we really want to be able to create change, we have to work collectively, we have to work together in coalition, and we have to make sure that we don't only get involved in coalition when it impacts our community only.
I want to just add quickly from a historical perspective that there are really important bridges between the Arab American and Asian American communities. So some of you may know about the case of Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was really the first victim of a hate crime after 9/11. He was a Sikh American in Arizona who 2 days after the 9/11 attacks was murdered by someone who believed that he was Arab American. And so there are even, across these communities, and very recently, examples in which we are really invested in this fight together. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, if I could add, we're really impacted even, I think if we look beyond, even if it doesn't impact our communities, we may sometimes realize that even though we thought it didn't, it does. So for example, after 9/11, the Patriot Act, and all policies that are now being used to surveil Black Lives Matter movements, and so I think there are always, it may begin with one of our communities, but it ends up impacting all our communities, which is where we really need to be supporting each of the communities and working together to change these policies, so we're not ending up in silos and we're not ending up maintaining the status quo.
Thank you. Celeste and Sina, let me invite you into this question of why is it important to build multiracial coalitions? And specifically, how do you talk to your membership about the importance of this so that we don't get so invested in our own individual communities?
So something that I heard recently, I was at a convening, I think, hosted by Asian Americans Advancing Justice, and I heard this really helpful question, which is we always have to ask ourselves, how does white supremacy recruit junior and local partners? And I was really impacted by that because I think that as a leading question can help us understand just how easy it is to get sucked in and how that is by design of white supremacy, by design of the US, by the design of the government to get us sucked into this idea, that we might call the model minority myth. And that I think draws us away from exactly what Rima was speaking on about just how interconnected we are. So I think asking that question, like, am I being recruited to be a junior or local partner, even if it seems by way of increased visibility for Asian Americans, or representation, or again, like an emphasis on personality. What is that actually drawing away from? What is the greater motive there? And then I think at Rising Voices, something that we talk about a lot is this false illusion of safety that has been promised to us by the model minority myth, that we know actually, in my mind, being a fourth generation Japanese American, when I learned about the creation of the model minority myth, it was pretty much, to me, synonymous with anti-Blackness. It was created at the time when the United States government was trying to assimilate Japanese Americans after they were released from incarceration and being resettled, especially here in the US and in Michigan. So I think having that awareness of whose interest is it in for us to remain silent, just as Rima was saying, there is actually a vested interest by the right, by white supremacy, by the powers that be. And so us gathering, feeling in coalition, feels like an act of resistance. So yeah, I think I would start there. And I know that the conversations are really uncomfortable, but I think even to give a hyper local example, after the recent very tragic school shootings, one of our community organizers was in conversation with a lot of other parents in Macomb County who, rightfully so, were terrified about sending their kids to school. And we were having a lot of really productive conversations about how more policing is not the answer, and how historically more policing hasn't actually kept our communities safe. And so I think identifying the ways that that question precipitates into the actual issues that affect our communities, so safety being one of them, is how we start to chip away at the conversation.
Yeah, Celeste and Rima, you guys nailed it. You guys did everything I wanted to say, but it really is just having those uncomfortable conversations, and as controversial as they may be, they are necessary for us to realize how interconnected we are, and then asking ourselves the question of, why is it important to show up, and who does this benefit, and just what comes out of it, because it really is just bigger than all of us. So, yeah.
So I think one of the things that can be hard in these conversations, right, is that we don't want to invalidate, members of our communities, their experiences and their fears and concerns. So within the last couple of years, we've certainly seen, heightened attacks and bias incidents against, for example, Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. So there is a real sense of fear, but we also want to, for example, have the conversation about the carceral state, the criminal justice system, and its systemic inequalities. And I think one of the hard things to do, especially with first-generation immigrants or older members of the community, is to have that conversation about white supremacy, have that conversation about criminal justice reform, because in some ways it seems like a more removed conversation for that. So if we can dig into maybe that aspect, which I think Celeste, you got us started thinking about, how do we do that, right? How do we have specifically that conversation about criminal justice reform and the importance, for example, of restorative justice approaches rather than doubling down on policing or immigration enforcement, which disproportionately impacts all of our communities, whether it's Black or Asian or Arab American. So how do we have those conversations? I don't know if Celeste, you want to start us off. Of course, I see you smiling there, so maybe you've got something to add.
I think the biggest problem we have is that, at least with my community, we view police and criminal justice a little bit differently. I mean, when you go back to lynchings, I chaired the National Rebuild Black Wall Street with Hill Harper and Cornel West, and we raised money. And when you looked at that, I mean, that was an orchestrated event that involved the criminal justice system that enabled it to occur. So our sense of police is a little bit different, where some communities see them as friends, we see them as foe. And my latest mantra has been, we're being killed in the courts. I mean, it's no longer lynch from trees, it's a gavel that does it. And there's such a distinction between what happens to us. And by the way, it's one of the main reasons that I'm so appalled by President Trump and how all that's been handled, even the January 6th people, is because we're putting people in jail for 20 years for stealing. And these people try to take our country and they're walking away scot-free. So, I think criminal justice reform is very important because it's the legal process that they're using now to be able to do things to us as grossly, not fair. How do we do that? Well, in our community, we elect judges. We in Detroit have not had as much success with the circuit court level, where some of the more civil things take place in judgments in that case. But the fundamental approach to me, and I'll be real short, is that we can't just keep critiquing and talking about, I call it speech equity. We need sweat equity. We need people who be the little yeast that leathers the whole loaf, who get in the system, become a part of the system, and change the system.
Others want to weigh in on this question?
I think I would uplift and reciprocate what Mr. Sheffield is saying, that a lot of it begins with political education. And I think that's even such it's a not cool word, but like what it actually means and what it actually feels like is hearing those stories. And I think that we can do that on a community level, especially when we're building these multiracial spaces. And I think I learned this also from working with Mika Kennedy on the Exile Timothy project about community history of Japanese Americans. We're not being taught this in schools. So I would love to, for example, hear more stories from Mr. Sheffield, from others on this panel. I think telling those stories is the way we start the conversations to show, we're being fed a lie, for example, that more policing is going to make us feel safe. But we can show you that if we talk about if we hear these stories, if we talk about the actual history, it doesn't hold up. The lie will crumble because police have never kept our communities more safe. I mean, even with the most recent example in Uvalde, the police, they waited while teachers were protecting our children. So I think investing in education and understanding school as a very radical space for potential for our children is at the center of a lot of our work when we start to think about where these conversations happen. And then also, of course, in the home, in these places that aren't as public, or maybe as flashing on social media, you were saying, that happens at the kitchen table, with your auntie, and learning the histories and being able to share and tell the stories that are, very deliberately being hidden from us, that really disprove the lies we're being fed. I think that's how we start to chip away at it.
Echoing off of what Celeste said, I think that, to me, I think the most important conversations are the ones that are had at home. I think that for my lack of understanding of what I've, been taught is just because of the fact that I am first generation, and there may be like a language barrier sometimes when it comes to the Asian community. There's hesitance, and there's confusion, and there's resistance in being able to just. Sorry, I'm having a hard time formulating my thought right now.
You mean to sort of explain the kind
Yes.
of issues of systemic
Yes.
inequality in the United States?
Exactly.
Or?
Yep. In order to explain that, and then when you do try to be, active in these things, also be reprimanded for that. So regardless, it is important to have these conversations, and even if there happens to be a language barrier.
Sorry, I could just like uplift what you're saying too, that language access is also something that has intentionally been kept from our communities. And so I think the more we invest in that, the more we can start to understand having those conversations, but also to add that it is going to be uncomfortable, and that as much as we're going to hold our values in our hearts, we really do have to meet our people where they're at, because this is not a perfectionism game. We know perfectionism is just another tool of white supremacy that wants to keep us in the silos. So I wanted to appreciate what you brought up about the language access as well.
So I think one of the, I want to just talk a little bit about what we've done in the last 10 years. We started having conversations within the Arab American community about what structural racism looks like, what systemic racism looks like, how we as Arab Americans may be benefiting from these systems, and how we should not be, because we're also impacted by these systems, right? So one of the struggles we had when starting these conversations is we realized that we were starting kind of over here, and people were really not there yet, because we hadn't even accepted that we were upholding these systems. And so we kind of had to take a few steps back and start talking about what does anti-Blackness and racism look like in our communities. Those are extremely difficult conversations, but they're conversations that engage people and that keep people engaged. We've had, and I'll be honest, it's been a messy process. It has not been, it ends in a lot of people being angry, but I think in the end, we're really bringing people into conversation. We're not calling people out, we're really calling them into these conversations. It's a process, it's the one way that we have found to keep people engaged in these conversations, so that we can not only, because one of the things we found was it almost feels hypocritical to be talking about systemic racism and how do we tackle systemic racism when we are upholding that within the community. And so what we have done is really think about how do we tackle it within our communities? What does anti-Blackness and racism look like within the Arab community? What issues of racism or anti-Blackness are we bringing with us as immigrants? And then that gets added on to racism within the US historical context, and you have something that looks very different than white supremacy. And so being able to have those conversations in our communities has not been easy. And it cannot be this one project. It has to be something that we really embed into everything. So for example, Access serves a large community, probably 50% Arab American, and the other 50% is community members from Detroit and Dearborn. And one of the things we've been thinking through is, what are the outcomes, for example, of Black males who come to Access different from the outcomes for Arab men who come through Access? And what are, and once we can start to think about it in that terms, you start to see where are our biases showing up in the way that we do things. And those are really, really difficult conversations, not just internally at Access, but with the community. But those are things that really end up not only being thinking through racism within our community, but then also being able to have an impact on the broader system of structural racism.
And so it's easier to see where other folks are wrong than it is where you are. And again, honoring my dad. I mean, he was a person that was extremely tolerant and embraced people of all colors. It's in his creed. And I find myself all the time correcting people in my community who want to use racial slurs as it relates to Arab Americans, but are appalled when people call them things. So it's the same evil. It's the same, nasty spirit that causes me to have vile thoughts about her based on her gender, her color, whatever, that you are opposed to as well. And so if we are appalled by what happens to us, we have to be sensitive to what happens to other folks. I also want to say this. I was just thinking because, I've never been mild-mannered. I led the protest at Boarding Table, 15,000 folks with Fred Finley was killed. But I've been telling people, you know what this country really needs? And it takes the kind of discipline that Dr. King and them had, they were taught. I believe in nonviolence, but I need there needs to be some vociferous, vehement nonviolence. Everyone that I know notices that we're at fever pitch. I fly all the time. The things that I've encountered when I've been on planes, the things that people have said to me, and I'm 6'5", 280 pounds. But I think we sometimes have this conversation with ourselves, and we haven't really ginned up the kind of, fever to let these people know this is a different generation. I tell people all the time that, this is a different generation. This is not we shall overcome crowd. This is the crowd that if the Proud Boys come to Detroit, they're gonna be some bad boys, and we're gonna all have trouble. But the point I'm trying to make, I'm not advocating violence, but we gotta let them know we ain't taking this shit. Excuse my French.
You and Helen have that.
The Lord just granted me the dogs. But we come and we lament among ourselves. I mean, we have this conversation, talk radio. But sometime, at some point, some of these folks need to know we're coming together, and we ain't going for this. We just not going for this.
We got to make some good choices, right? Let me take a slight detour, and I want to maybe direct this question to Celeste and Sina in particular, because I'm prompted by the conversation that Richard had earlier about metamorphosis, right? And the question of whether there was a point in your kind of career as activists where it clicked for you that this is an issue, that systemic inequality is an issue, right? Because we're talking about how something that happens to us, we can then translate into understanding and empathy for others, right? How do you explain that process of self-realization that this is an issue that concerns not only myself, but all of us? Can you maybe think of an incident, a moment where you became aware that, as an Asian American, that this was an issue that really affected you and that you needed to work with others on this issue?
Of course, after the spa shooting and the uproar of the Asian hate crimes, I did feel called to action. But I do remember a specific point in time where I was with my friend, his name is Eddie, and he's a Chinese American. He's someone I went to high school with. And after the protest, he asked me if I knew about Vincent Chin actually, and I told him no, because I did not. I had no idea. And he gave me the backstory on him. And it was in that moment that I realized, how is it that I don't know who he is and I'm doing the work that I'm doing? Clearly, I'm not educated enough, and we aren't being educated enough about the history that happens here in our city and the history that happens to our community in our nation. So that was a pivoting moment for me to continue to do the work that I'm doing, but expand it by educating myself. And through educating myself, I'm able to also care better for my community.
So it's hard for me to think of one precise moment, but I would say, I don't know, maybe a lot of biracial people will unfortunately resonate with this, but growing up with an Asian American mother and a white father, I've known about racism since I was a child. I think I didn't have the language for it at the time, but it's very painful to realize like the dichotomy between the way the world has treated my father versus the way the world has treated my mother, and watching that for a long time, especially because it's gendered and it's classed as well. it's hard for me to put a specific moment on just like this accumulation of very painful experiences. But I would also say to Sina's point, especially in the context of this weekend, I grew up in Ferndale and I still live there now. And as it was mentioned, Ferndale is where the Golden Star restaurant was, where Vincent Chin worked. And I remember when I was a teenager, there was, I believe the Michigan State Bar was revealing this memorial plaque to commemorate Vincent Chin in Ferndale. And my mother was the one who brought me there and tried to explain the story to me. And I just remember feeling, I don't know, Ferndale's not a town with a ton of Asian Americans. And I just remember like feeling very tied to this event that almost felt like a ghost that had been like actually ever present in my life. And then of course growing up, more I had heard from my uncle about working on the case. But yeah, I would say in terms of like being called to these issues, unfortunately, it's like, it feels like something that I've been fighting against like my whole life, just from like watching the relationship between my parents.
Thanks for sharing. I want to just wrap up this maybe section of questioning by noting that thankfully there have been a lot of work done in terms of creating resources that help specifically Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities to educate each other about specifically the movement for Black Lives. So some of you may know about a resource called Letters for Black Lives, which is actually in various Asian languages to help younger generation activists and organizers have conversations in native languages with their elders about specifically anti-Blackness and criminal justice reform and some of these issues that we've been talking here. So do check that out if you're looking for something to help out in your own work. Let's look forward. We talked a little bit about coalition building, about the importance of that. We know that this fight is long, right? That the arc towards justice, bends, but we're doing the bending and it's taken a lot of work and things keep happening. And one of the things that I want to ask you all to address, and maybe we'll start with Horace on this, is how do we take care of ourselves in this? How do you keep your stakeholders, your community motivated and engaged? What does healing look like in this world of hurt? Can you maybe shed some light to start?
Well, let me just harken back to the question about that moment. I think we have a moment now when I think about the coalition that came out of Vincent Chin's death, which held together for many, many years. And then maybe the four of us here recall at this precise moment in time and space to reenact that Detroit interethnic coalition, because we do face common foes and common worries. Well, the biggest thing for me, and the biggest change for me, is that I don't take responsibility for others anymore. I've freed myself from what you do, or, all I can do, the best I can do is share the information, parse the truth so that you understand what we're really dealing with. Because, it's hard to get people motivated. And so I'm always mindful, we have people today, right, who probably think this isn't successful because the auditorium is not full. And I remind myself, because I was with my dad when he was organizing stuff for Dr. King. All the people claiming to be with Dr. King were, the movement wouldn't have lasted as long as it did. You're not going to get everybody. People are not going to share your opinions. And so for me, short answer is, I have faith. I'm a pastor. I believe that the justice for others and the good for others is what this God I serve wishes to see. And therefore, if I don't have but 2 loaves of bread and 5 fish, if I don't take responsibility to yield it to that power, that somehow or another we will have what we need. And it takes something other than us. It really does. And I'll say this and be done, and that is, I wish there was a way that all of us could use that would be a simple formula for us to get people to take responsibility for what they have. And what I find, and may be true for you, I don't know, is that people will come to people like us, and they'll be all riled up, they want to do something, and as soon as their particular issue is resolved, they're no longer engaged. And getting people to understand that that if others help them to get what they need, then they need to then pay it forward and do the same. Remember?
So I think I'm just going to go back to what we were talking about earlier, which is if we're happy with the status quo, then we continue to work in silos, and that's something that I would, I continuously remind people is that if you are okay with the way things are now, then we can continue to tackle these issues in silos, or we can come together in coalition and really build power for our communities, and not just put band-aids on things that are happening.
So Sina, your thoughts on how to keep folks motivated? So I know you've talked specifically about healing as one of the things that Rising Voices really focused on. What does that mean when we're talking about social justice? What is healing, which all of us think maybe about as a medical term? What does that mean for the communities that we work for?
Yes, I love this question of healing. So at Rising Voices, we talk like every day, because the work can get so draining. We talk every day about envisioning a world for our community, for our babies, where we're not just surviving, but we're thriving. And we talk about Asian American joy and love. And I think that was something that was brought up during one of the musical performances last night that I really loved, because we're hearing the phrase Asian hate so much. But like, what does Asian American love look like? And I think that's something that we've actually worked on a lot, because hope is a discipline. It can be really easy to get so cynical looking at the evidence. But painting a vision for our communities where our children are both seen and heard in the classroom, and so we can think of that in two ways: seen being learning Asian American history, getting ethnic studies, getting the ethnic studies ethos, which is about relationships. It's actually about how we treat each other. It's not just about getting an updated textbook. And then being heard, like having language access, being able to speak in like a mother tongue and speak in multiple languages and not be shamed for that, but be celebrated. And so we have to have these visions to be able to actually walk towards, and not just always like allow ourselves to fall prey to the media's portrayal of us as being reactive and being victims, because we do have visions and we do have desires for a world where our communities are actually thriving. And so we just have to be able to keep reminding ourselves that that's possible, and it's something that we're allowed to dream of, and then also continue to like just love on each other. We can continue to do that as a way of feeling joy, and I think it's Adrienne Brown says that we have to make the movement irresistible. And so I think holding that in our, that's why I'm dressed like a Spice Girl, like like we can be joyous, we deserve that.
I really like what you said, Celeste. I think that's such a good question. What does Asian American love look like, right? And I don't know, that's something that I think we all want to be more familiar with and recognize ourselves with, is what does that look like? It makes me think about how, when you think of like Asian American and like activist, it sounds like an oxymoron. But when we realize, our powers and we combine our powers, like what does that look like, instead of segregating ourselves? So thank you for that.
Yeah, the healing question and keeping each other motivated.
To me personally, the healing for me comes with being able to have a conversation with my elders. I think that's very important for us to have a conversation with our elders. And even if they do not understand, it's important in our job to at least understand like why does they feel this way and where it comes from, and how we can help them heal through it by just communicating with them.
Thank you so much for all of your thoughts. We have about 10 minutes left, and I want to save a few minutes for folks in the audience who may be doing work of their own, who may be actively engaged in activism, who want to maybe talk with the panelists that we have assembled today about some of their work and their ideas about how to create change that's sustainable, that's making good, boisterous trouble in the world. So please feel free to line up at the microphones. We have one on each side of the aisle. Come on down, and we invite you to share your name, the organization that you may be affiliated with, and your thoughts and comments. We have one already. Go ahead, please. Hold on just a second. I think we need to activate the mic. It's Jericho over here. Hello? Yep, we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Tyler from Detroit. I just wanted to start by saying thank you. This has been really enlightening, amazing, and honestly just so informative, wonderful to have this experience. Earlier, you guys talked about the idea of having, well, mostly this one, you talked about the idea of having uncomfortable conversations with your elders. And I just wanted to go and ask two questions, really. One more specific on how did you overcome those hurdles in your life personally? Like what made it easier to either have them understand or just kind of listen to like what you experienced and what you learned? And also, I guess more broadly, how do you build up like the credibility for the organizations and movements you start or the advocacy that you do?
That's a great question. I know some of us have legacy organizations that have built-in support. Some of us are newer, so I'd love to hear from all folks, not just Sina.
I'm also from Troy, by the way, so that's cool. It's really just by being very resilient and continuous in what I do. I think that I've received a lot of like discouragement from it, but it's really just by showing up and just not giving a shit. So yeah, and what was your second question?
How do you like build up credibility for your organization?
My credibility. To be honest, the work that I'm doing, it's something that it really did just, it fell into my lap. It's something that happened very spontaneously, but something that I'm very grateful for. So I do feel like I got very lucky with just being able to form the org that I've been able to do and to be able to have support from the AAPI community to build it up to where it has gone in the direction that it's taken.
Rima, do you want to add something about?
Yeah, in terms of having difficult conversations, so, you know, I've had many difficult conversations with elderly and with, you know, with individuals in the community that we're trying to open up these conversations that are very difficult. And I would say one of the ways that's been most, I think, impactful is to listen to them as well, right? To remember to ask questions rather than, I mean, so many times I just want to scream, right? What are you talking about? This is terrible. What you're saying is terrible. But it's really listening to where they're coming from and asking them questions about where they came from, because that often brings up things I think that they haven't really thought about, and really through asking them questions can really bring up where their feelings are coming from. And that doesn't mean, I hope, you know, one of the things I've learned, you know, I'm probably the second oldest on the stage, but one of the things I've learned is it's okay to walk away from a conversation not having convinced the other person, right? And not to always expect that you're going to change their mind. But you'd be surprised at how much asking questions and asking them about their experiences and their history can really bring them to a better place. I don't know if I'll call it a better place, but to really question the things that they're saying.
And then that goes back to what Horace was saying earlier.
Yeah, and the credibility is about the authenticity. You know, people know when people care. That's not something you can fake or feign. One of the reasons we have the success in the Sheffield Center, we service thousands of folks. The mayor came over there, in fact, we had 500 folks showing up for vaccinations. They had 50 downtown. It's because people know we care. And my theme is to be all things to all people according to their need. That's important because folks want you to do things that they don't need. But yeah, if you do the work and you generally put them first, and you're tough with them when they need it. I mean, sometimes they need some castor oil, you know, not vanilla ashtray. So they'll know because you show them that you care, and that's, you know, louder than words.
Thank you. Let's go over here for our next comment or question. Can you tell us your name and share with us your thoughts?
Yes, hi, my name name is Helen Zia, and I just what the comment that the pastor mentioned about this being a new generation, and everybody's on social media these days. My question is, how has social media helped or hindered your coalition building, especially in light of misinformation that's out there, and also the fact that social media does make a lot of money, they profit off of division and divide. How do you see that going forward in terms of helping with your coalition building?
I do a regular. I have more younger people who work for me than have ever worked. I mean, almost everybody we hire now is like 20-some years of age. And so one young lady just graduated from the University of Michigan. She tapes everything. So I'm doing, they're not blogs, I'm doing segments on social media. And it's amazing me the response that I get. It's called As I See It, which is what column my dad used to write in the Detroit News and Chronicle. I mean, you have to be out there, but the problem is when you rely upon that solely as the medium of expression for you to convince people and get the word out, you still have to do one-on-one. And I love her conversation about, you know, every encounter is not trying to win folks over. Sometimes I need to shut up, listen, and they may be giving me some information that I didn't have that will help me better do the work that I'm doing. So if nothing takes the place of dealing with people face to face.
Maybe another way to reframe that question is, how do you translate that online interest and social media engagement into in-person action? I don't know if maybe Celeste or Sina, I know Sina, like WWN doesn't have a website, if I'm not mistaken, but you do a lot of organizing on Instagram, right? So how do you translate that from one kind of online platform into in-person marches and petitions? How do you translate sort of online momentum into in-person momentum, which, as Horace was saying, is kind of the stuff that you still need to do at the end of the day? Feel free to weigh in too, Celeste. I know that Rising Voices is also very active on social media.
No, it's a tricky question, but I think it goes back to what Mr. Sheffler brought up, that social media can be great, I think, because it's so accessible. I love how accessible it is in terms of educating ourselves and staying up to date. But in terms of like being able to build folks' energy to what is going to push them to actually, especially because we're in an extremely unsafe time. You know, for those who are at risk during the pandemic, I know that it's like especially scary to think about what would it take to go to an action. But in order to like push people past that, you know, like emotional spike and like hit that you get into your brain of like engaging in something on social media versus actually showing up in person, it really does take them one-on-one conversations, because people have to feel invested and they have to understand that they absolutely have a place in the movement. And I think social media can, like, while it helps us, while it's so accessible, it kind of encourages this feeling of like apathy. And so we have to keep having one-on-one conversations to let people know that they are like absolutely needed and invested in, and to know what their stake is in actually showing up in person. And I think a lot of that like lull that we see is because cynicism gets the better of people. Like I noticed that even with myself, like over engaging on social media can also just like tip into cynicism. So we can't really underestimate the importance of one-on-one conversations, even though they take more time.
You know, what I found is a lot of times people think because they've replied or they've said something or they've commented as if that's their contribution to solving the problem. It's not. And then you can get so caught up in debating folks, you know, who often misinterpret what you've said and all, you know, it's great, but it's certainly not the panacea.
I think, so I'm going to say something really controversial for everybody who disagrees, I'm sorry, but I think we need to, every growing nonprofit that I've worked with says their biggest struggle is engaging people on social media. And I think what we're trying to do maybe just isn't possible. And so what we have struggled with that, you know, through the work that we've done, is to use social media in that way. We're kind of in a place where we use social media to organize. So we say, here's where we're going to be, here's what we're going to do. meet us there. But I feel like we keep trying to do this thing, which is engage. And there are some few who are going to be able to do it. But I think there might be limitations to everybody being able to do it on social media, right? To engage people on social media. The other fear I have is that if we continue to try to engage people on social media, we have this culture of like clicking like means like people are feeling like they've done something, right? Or they've reshared a post. And I think we haven't really, you're not going to be able to get that excitement that you had during the civil rights era, right? And people have to be there in person and have to feel this camaraderie. So I'm only saying, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying if it's not working for you at the moment, maybe try to do it another way, which is what we've done, and I think we've had some success in engaging, especially young people.
So unfortunately, we have to wrap up, but I want to use that as a way to sort of thank everyone for coming, for recapturing that spirit of being together collectively, so that we can celebrate the work that has been done and look forward to the work that we still have yet to do. I would hope that everyone in the audience today and watching on the live stream will think of one sort of short-term solution that they can take, whether it is liking or resharing a post or joining an organization, to one long-term solution that they can do. Something that they can contribute to on a systemic level, whether it's joining a petition to advance AAPI studies and history in K-12 curriculum, or signing on to some of the work that's happening for this new National Museum of Asian American History and Culture. We're going to need all hands on deck. We're going to need short-term solutions and long-term solutions. But to close, let me please thank again, and please join me in thanking Horace Sheffield, Rima Merriway, Solis Getter, and Sina Van. I'm Ian Chen. Thank you so much for coming, and we look forward to seeing you around Detroit and Michigan.